I've been sounding the alarm for now almost 7 years about early releases. And not just early releases, but, you know, maybe it's because I'm a woman, maybe it's because I'm a career prosecutor, but the fact that we do not call domestic violence and human trafficking and felons in possession of guns and raping and drugging a woman or assault with a deadly weapon, the fact that we do not call those crimes violent crimes, which means that our correctional system now thinks that your sentence is really only worth a third, even though you have a long violent record, I find that despicable. And I have been advocating for those changes for years. You know, we can be the most progressive state you want to say we are, supporting women or whatever it is, but when we continue to tell, you know, our community that domestic violence is a non-violent crime, entitling you now, if corrections has their way, to 66% credits off your sentence, no matter what your violent record is, I find that atrocious.
Thanks for coming in. Before we get to the hard-hitting, substantive policy questions, I just wanted to ask you a few questions just to kind of give people a sense of who you are.
Sure.
So could you talk to us about what's the most difficult thing you've done in your life?
In my career? Or just in life?
In general.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm going to talk about my career because I think that's really what matters to voters, is making difficult decisions and recognizing that there is a human toll that we have to be willing to confront in terms of crime. So, you know, there's been difficult decisions in this community, whether it's the Stephon Clark case, whether it's telling families, you know, the realities of some of the things that we have to deal with because of policies or whatever it is. But, you know, it can be personnel issues. It's, you know, if you're going to be a leader, you have to have hard conversations that, in a very difficult world where people's lives have been changed on both sides of the aisle.
Is there a particular conversation that you recall as being especially challenging?
Some of it could be graphic, if you want me to be honest. Some of the decisions that are, and this is even before I was elected DA. I mean, I had a case one time when I was doing sexual assault cases where a woman was assaulted, and as a result of that, she got pregnant as a result of the assault, and she had to figure out if that was a result of the perpetrator or her own relationship with her husband. And so she had to make her own difficult decision. And she made the decision, and it was actually her husband's. And so that was, honestly, it's like when you ask me that question, it brings me back to very hard conversations that there are consequences to crime. And so, I mean, there's lots of those. It's, you know, one of the things I talk about a lot is if we cannot recognize the human toll of crime in our policies and our laws, then we're failing, because we have to always put those at the forefront. So for instance, 20 plus years ago, when I started doing cold cases, one of the first cases that we kind of dusted off the shelf was the kidnap, rape, murder of a woman named Eva Chu, who worked right here at where the Cal EPA building is now. But she was 7 months pregnant. She left her job to go to her doctor's appointment. She was kidnapped in the middle of the day. 2 days later, her car was found on the WX. So this is 1979, okay? This is 40 years ago, whatever. And 2 days after her car was found, her body was found off of Interstate 80. She had been strangled to death and raped, and obviously her unborn baby was killed. So we had to go 20 plus years after the crime. I asked the detective, have you talked to her husband? She was married with a 2-year-old. And he had tried to reach him, couldn't get a hold of him. And I said, well, where does he work? And he said he works at this little grocery store in Southland Park. I said, well, let's just go. This is 2000 or 2001 or so. And so we drove over there, and he brought us into a little storage closet. We said, we have to talk to you about your wife's murder. We had identified the guy through DNA. He was in prison for another crime he'd committed. And so we told him, and he just started to cry. This is 20 plus years after his wife was killed. And he looked at me and he said, well, this was just all my fault. And I said, oh my goodness, Mr. Chu, why would you say that? And he said, because I was supposed to take her to the doctor that day. So now so that for me, I still, years later, am impacted by that consequence for that family. But I also fast forward to our legislature thought it was wise to introduce a bill last year that would allow that person who was convicted by a jury to never get out of prison to now petition 20 years later to get out. And so I had to talk to his daughter, who's now 40 years later, she's a teacher here in this community. And she can't even have a conversation without sobbing about the impact that had. And she was 2. And so when I say we have to have difficult conversations, we do. And it's sometimes it's families that, perhaps it's the accused or the incarcerated. Sometimes it's families that have been victimized. So we can't ever lose sight of that when we make decisions, whether it's actually in the courtroom, in our legislature, out ballot box, it's those kinds of things.
Well, thanks for going there.
Sure.
You mentioned difficult conversations. I wonder, in your own life, you have friends, you have family who you disagree with politically.
Sure. Yeah, plenty.
How do you have those conversations? How do you sort of bridge that gap, or do you just avoid politics?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, let's be honest. I don't agree with some of the things my brother does. Doesn't mean I don't love him. It just means that, well, I mean, I try not to ignore things. I think it's important to show up and have conversations. I come from a big family. We're very diverse. There's 7 kids in my family. We're very diverse on who we married, who we love, all those things. I'm not afraid to say, no, I don't agree with you on gay marriage. I'm gay and this is who I am as a person. I have 2 children. I'm raising 2 children. So I think I try to be authentic who I am as a person in my personal life. I'm also believe very wholeheartedly I'm authentic in my position. So, even as a boss, as the DA, I have to be honest. Maybe somebody wasn't promoted and they want to know, why can't I get promoted? I'm going to be honest. I will be compassionate in the way I say this is why, or this is what you need to do, or whatever it is. But it's not fair to people if we're not honest in that. And so I can disagree and still love people. Doesn't mean I can disagree and still value them as employees. But you got to show up and you got to be honest.
You mentioned your brother, and just for anyone who's watching at home who doesn't know, your brother helped lead the Prop A campaign.
Yes.
So I imagine it's one thing to have disagreements politically about something kind of abstract, tax policy, for example.
Sure.
But for something like marriage and love, I imagine that was it challenging to keep the personal and the political separate in that case?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm at a complete opposite than him on that issue. I'm not in the closet. I haven't been in the closet in a long time. I'm gay. I have 2 children. At the time he ran Prop 8, I had a domestic partner at the time, because I didn't have gay marriage. But but it was personal to me, because I know how I am as a mom, and I know how I am as a person, and I know that I have the same challenges as anybody else does. And so, his views are his views. His views are perhaps based in his religion, and I don't disrespect anybody's religion. I just disagree.
I know we've talked about this before, but you used to be a Republican.
Used to be.
You changed that in 2018. Can you talk about why?
Yeah. I registered as a Republican as 18. My dad was a Republican. My mom had died when I was a kid, of cancer. But, I'm a good citizen. I always vote. I don't consider myself like this big politician. I'm not. I am a prosecutor. That's all I've ever done. And when I ran the left, I never have, nor would I, allow politics to play a role in the job of being the prosecutor or public safety professional. It's not an R or D issue. But in 2018, the race became so, honestly, disgustingly politicized. I was like, what do you mean? I'm this for that. I mean, it became so partisan in a nonpartisan race. And I got accused of things, and I'm like, well, that's not true, and that is that. And so I just made a decision in 2018, not because I'm mad at a party or not mad at a party, but I'm fed up with the politics of it all. And I wanted to be authentic to the position. Public safety is not, nor should it be, an R. It's not a red versus blue team. And I think even in today's climate, especially when you're starting to see this momentum of recalls, of Gascon or Bodine, that this is about public safety. And so for me, I just wanted to be authentic to me as a person and me as a professional. And I am perfectly content running as an NPP.
Did you ever see yourself re-registering as a Republican?
No, I don't. I mean, it's so funny because when I was trying to kind of mull over this idea to be, should I run, should I not run? I have friends on both sides, right? You should become a Democrat. You should become a Republican. I'm like, no, I'm going to stick with what I think is authentic. I have my own views, personal views on things in life. That's fine. It's not going to change who I am as a public servant. So no, I don't. And it's not because I'm mad at anybody or anything like that. It's just that I feel very authentic to me. And I feel authentic to this position as being an MPP.
So is there a particular issue, policy that was sort of the kind of breaking point for you in terms of feeling like you no longer identify ideologically and fully as a Republican? Was there a particular...
Well, no. Again, it wasn't about all of a sudden I was mad at the Republican Party or that I was philosophically, it wasn't about that. It was about that particular race. And I say this, and perhaps this is a little bit flippant, but I feel like I should have a bumper sticker that just says, if you're sick of politics, I'm your candidate. Because I think people, even now, as you look at the state, people are divisive. And I think, or there has been this divide, and I really believe that this job, as a prosecutor, as the elected DA, as the Attorney General, should not be about whether you're on a blue team or a red team or you're Republican or whatever it is. It's about public safety, and that transcends all politics, and it should.
Great.
So hopefully it's okay.
Well, thank you for all that. I'm going to kick it over to Nigel on the big screen
Nigel.
over there.
As I look at you below this.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Polls are showing growing concern about crime. We've seen the numbers of certain aspects of crime go up in 2019 and 2020 and 2020 and 2021. What are the first two things, or at least two initiatives, let's be first, two initiatives that you would pursue to address that?
To address crime?
To address, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, there's two parts to it. You mean initiatives like legal initiatives, or like what my priorities would be? Like, you mean like fixing 47 and 57? Or you mean like, what would I do when I get in the office?
Well, sure. Well, first of all, maybe extrapolate what you mean by fixing 47 and 57.
Okay. I guess I walked into that one, huh? I have long been raising the alarm about the challenges that we face with Prop 47 and Prop 57. I actually remember before I got elected in 2014, wasn't sworn until 2015. I recall very vividly being on a phone call with some of the retailers saying, this might not work out so well here if we're going to basically decriminalize theft and drugs, and we're not going to have the tools as prosecutors anymore to address drug addiction if we're going to reduce everything down to misdemeanors. So I believed at that time, I believe to this day, that the consequences of 47 are very vivid now. There are, in my opinion, we've got kind of two kinds of thieves out there now. We have thieves that are just stealing to go perhaps resell it. And then we have people that are stealing because they have significant drug addiction and they have to support their habit. And so when 47 was passed, perhaps folks didn't know that prosecutors had very, in the courts, and our justice partners had these really good tools called drug courts, which would get people into drug treatment in lieu of incarceration, and that now has been essentially taken away from us. So I do believe that the issues that we're facing, perhaps with the crisis of drug addiction, mental health, and homelessness, I do believe there's a correlation. I think we've got serial theft. Assemblymember Cooper, Jim Cooper, and I have been longtime allies on various public safety issues. I think, that's an example of politics transcending public safety. We partnered together on Prop 20. I'm not afraid of the fact that we were trying to make some of these fixes that was trying to get people back into drug treatment without sending them to jail or prison. So that's 47. Prop 57, it's not a secret. I've been sounding the alarm for now almost 7 years about early releases. And not just early releases, but, maybe it's because I'm a woman, maybe it's because I'm a career prosecutor, but the fact that we do not call domestic violence and human trafficking and felons in possession of guns and raping and drugging a woman or assault with a deadly weapon, the fact that we do not call those crimes violent crimes, which means that our correctional system now thinks that your sentence is really only worth a third, even though you have a long violent record, I find that despicable. And I have been advocating for those changes for years. We can be the most progressive state you want to say we are, supporting women or whatever it is, but when we continue to tell, our community that domestic violence is a non-violent crime, entitling you now, if corrections has their way, to 66% credits off your sentence, no matter what your violent record is, I find that atrocious. And so for me, that probably doesn't answer your question, but I do think that some of the fixes that we do need is we have to be willing to hold people accountable and get them the treatment they need. So when we send somebody, if we happen to, without using specific examples, if we send somebody that's got a long record to prison, let's say he's got let's say he's got a strike for what we call a prior violent or serious crime. Let's say he's got a prior 211, a robbery, and we send him to prison for beating a woman. And that judge sentenced him to, say, 12 years. And now all of a sudden we're going to let him out in 4. But we really haven't, our correctional system hasn't done an adequate job of rehabilitating. We've just handed out credits because we just want to hand out credits. That's not a service to that individual. That's not a service to the community. It's not a service to the victim. And that's not really good for public safety. So for me, when I talk about what are the important issues right now if I get in, dealing with violent crime and the astronomical number of illegal weapons on our streets. We've been talking about this for well over a year since the pandemic hit. And it could be a combination of tsunami of things. Maybe it's that we handed out $30 billion to EDD money to people that shouldn't have had it. Maybe it's the fact that we've let out 27,000 inmates since the beginning of the pandemic. Maybe it's the fact that when we send somebody to prison for 10 years, they get out in less than half without the adequate rehab. So there is a combination. But as the AG, yeah, we've got to deal with this violent crime and homeless issue. I'm not homeless. We do need to deal with that issue. But we need to deal with violent crime and illegal guns. And that means that you got to have prevention, clearly. You got to get into people's lives long before they enter the justice system. When they enter the justice system, we have to get them accountable, but we also have to give them the treatment, and we have to invest in people, in the infrastructure. So instead of just, pushing people out of the jail without adequate rehab, or when they get out without adequate supervision, we need to invest. We have to fund law enforcement to go take the guns out of the hands of people that shouldn't have them. So, I don't think, other than the criminals, I don't think there's anybody that thinks a felon should be in possession of an assault weapon or a machine gun. I don't think there's anybody that thinks that. So we need to fund that to get that off the streets. And then when we prosecute them and a judge sentences them, we need to not only rehab them, but they have to be held accountable.
So, sorry, one question.
I know I went off for a little bit there.
In a report about the AG's office from the Department of Finance, I think a few weeks ago.
A few weeks or years ago?
A few weeks ago. Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay.
My mask. They noted that one of the problems with getting guns off the streets from the AG's office is that, they don't have enough employees. That's
true.
A huge problem.
Yes.
They have the funding in a sense, but they haven't been able to fill these positions. How would you approach that? I mean, because you can get as much money as you want, but if there's a shortage of people, if there's a shortage of employees, then you're kind of in the same issue, the same problem. So how would you approach that?
Well, that may be true for DOJ agents in terms of a lack of agents because they've got a limited number, but it's not necessarily true in terms of partnering with law enforcement. I mean, there's 90,000 cops or something in California. And for me, I've spent my 30 years building relationships with law enforcement. So it's about working together in a collaborative approach of getting those. So I think you're talking about like the prohibited persons database. That's true. But we've also got to get out into the community. Listen, there's a small percentage of folks that are the drivers of violent crime. So we've got to be willing to partner with law enforcement across the state to go out there proactively, and target the most dangerous people to make sure they don't have guns.
So is that something you think the DOJ doesn't do a good job of now?
I think there needs to be more. Listen, I think that we are in a crisis of not just of people that have guns that shouldn't have guns, particularly felons, and people that are subject to restraining orders. So it means that I'm going to do everything in my power working with law enforcement across the state, both DOJ and the hundreds, if not more, police agencies across California.
Okay.
So you brought up Prop 20 and
Yes.
the will of the voters. So let's talk about that for a second. In 2014, California voters passed Prop 47.
Right.
In 2016, they passed Prop 57. Both of those, one reduced sentences or reduced penalties on certain crimes. The other one made it easier for certain inmates to get out of prison earlier. In 2020, as you mentioned, you supported something with Prop 20, and voters rejected that. They rolled back a lot of Prop 47. Do you think that voters are going to agree with the arguments that you're making now after rejecting them in 2020?
I think if voters are fully informed about what various things do, and the AG obviously plays a significant role in ballot titles and summaries, but, for instance, on Prop 57, my big beef with it, main beef, has been that it was dubbed the denies early parole for nonviolent offenders. Okay, but we're not telling the public these other crimes are violent crimes. So this, and same with Prop 47. How was that written? Safe Streets and Neighborhood Act. There was a lot of promises of money going into drug treatment. The last time I checked with Sac County, again, I'm going to caveat this by saying the last time we hadn't received any dollars from the quote unquote savings. So if we're actually going to do what we say we're going to do, we got to be honest with people. So I think we're at a time in California right now where people are reeling the consequences of poor public policies, or as I call it, a tsunami of poor public policies. And it doesn't mean that, people want to say, oh, she's the law and order person, she wants to put everybody in prison. That's not a true statement. I want to hold people accountable. But if we're going to put people in jail or prison, we owe it to that individual and to our community and to the crime victims to make sure that those people receive the services without just pushing them out the door without the adequate rehab. I think there's plenty of examples of that. Prop 20, let's be honest, it was outspent. I mean, some of the election outcomes oftentimes are who has the most money. I wrote that along with other DAs to be very, very balanced. And people may not, if you don't read the weeds of it, it wasn't going to send anybody back to prison. It was designed to deal with serial theft, to get people back into drug treatment. It was designed to also call those crimes that I've been complaining about actually violent. It was designed to allow us to collect DNA on individuals that no longer had to give it when Prop 47 passed. So it wasn't this crazy ballot initiative that was designed to put a bunch of people in prison. That wasn't the purpose. The purpose was to deal with some of the challenges. And maybe it was too much in the weeds. Maybe it was too big. But I'm not afraid to try to go big and try to fix things that I think we need to fix.
And your belief is that if voters properly understood what 47, 57, and 20 were, that they would have sided with you, that the issues that they didn't understand?
I think it was very complex, and I think there was a lot of money. I think, so I'm not naive about the costs of raising money for ballot initiatives. It's an extraordinary undertaking. So I think it's twofold. It's understanding it and having the ability to pay for the message out there. And maybe the timing. Maybe it wasn't the timing. We're in a different time now than we were even 2 years ago.
Great. I, like many people in this room, am a recipient of your campaign emails.
Did you sign up?
Oh boy. I will sign up. So in those emails, what we see is not necessarily going in Bonta, but going at the liberal district attorneys in SF and in Los Angeles.
Right.
And of course, they've had a recent rise in crime in those cities, and you've called that out. But in
Right.
2020, and according to reporting from 2021, gun homicides in Sac County jumped by more than 50% in the prior 2 years. So if you're going to blame those guys, you're going to blame Gascon for the rise in crime, you're going to blame Booker for the rise in crime, shouldn't we also hold you responsible for the rise in crime here in Sac County?
I think the difference is that is a matter of how you handle it. I have never denied that we've seen a rise in crime. We see a rise in crime across California and across this country. The question is, how do you deal with it as a prosecutor? I don't think I'm going to have inmates celebrating Anne Marie Schubert in prison cells. Anne Marie Schubert's going to hold people accountable, and I'm not going to have blanket policies that essentially seek to dismantle the justice system. I'm not sending a message, come on to here to Sacramento because I won't file gang enhancements, gun enhancements, special circumstances. I'm going to let you out. I'm not going to have a policy that says, I don't care how many times you get arrested, I'm still going to have zero bail. So when I put out those emails, yeah, I am going after them because the current attorney general is ideologically aligned with those two people. And so for me, yeah, we have violent crime. There's no denying that. The question is, how do you deal with that? Anne Marie Schubert has been fighting these issues not since the day I announced my election, but since the day I became the DA. I've been, listen, let's talk about early release. I've been writing letters, my office, since 2015 on these issues, saying, here's what's going on. Here's what his or her history is. Here's why we are opposed to this. This person is still dangerous. So the difference between Anne Marie Schubert and Rob Bonta and George Gascon and Chesa Bodine is I'm a real prosecutor, first and foremost. But I'm not going to institute blanket policies that essentially are seeking to dismantle the system. I'm going to treat cases individually. I'm going to hold people accountable. I'm not going to have people going, well, I'm going to take it to the feds because I don't trust the prosecutor here in Los Angeles.
Sure. And just to clear, just off that question,
Sure.
Why should people trust your process, given the amount of time you had in office, over the processes that you're calling out from Bonta and from these other DAs?
Why should they trust my process? Well, first of all, I've never done anything else. I've been a prosecutor 31 years. Look at my record. When I ran for district attorney in Sacramento, my platform was, this is 2014, something, I think I started running probably 2013, but my whole philosophy was public safety is about prosecution, prevention, and innovation. That was 8 years or so ago now. And I look at what I've done. You go onto my office website. What have we done in the community to try to prevent crime, to enhance the quality of lives of people? We've done so many things, partnering with schools, reading with kids, going in and educating our businesses, educating immigrant community on their rights, alternatives. We've got more collaborative courts in Sacramento County perhaps than many other counties, whether mental health court, veterans court, reentry court, all of those things. 100% believe in that, okay? Prosecution's critical. When you commit a violent crime, yeah, we're going to hold you accountable. Where are we going to be innovative? Well, I think there's probably no better example of being innovative than the Golden State Killer and the exoneration of Ricky Davis. Because I believe in 100% that science can lead us to the truth on cases, wherever it leads us. And so we've used those tools to not only identify somebody that many people thought we never would, nor would ever find and catch and prosecute. But then you look at Ricky Davis, who was out of El Dorado County, who for years professed his innocence, and we used the very same tool to not only, quote unquote, exonerate him, El Dorado got him a new trial, but to actually find him factually innocent. Those are two moments in my career that I'm not going to forget. So look at my record. That's what I say. Look at what Anne Marie Schubert has done. When I probably drive people crazy because I probably have a list of 20 things that people need to do every day because how about this? How about this? How about this? Why can't we do this? And it's just because I love this profession and I'm a fixer by nature.
Prop 47 was a reaction to a feeling like we were over-incarcerating people, especially Black and Latino people. Sure. And the things like 3 strikes and stuff had right. Was not the proper way to handle crime. Do you think we were over-prosecuting or over-incarcerating during a couple decades there, and it needed some kind of correction?
Well, I would say this. I'm perfectly content with where 3 strikes is right now. I mean, I think it's serious, prior serious and violent with the current, what we call serious and violent. You know, we do want to put people there that are the most dangerous people, that are the most violent. There's been a lot of reforms. We've reduced the prison population from 2006. The height of it, I think, was 172,000, and now we're, I don't know, about 100,000. So we've, you know, we're still now below the federal cap. Doesn't mean we don't have more to do. No, I mean, I think there's always opportunities. Do I think back in the day that we should incarcerate somebody, we should have a penalty higher for crack cocaine than methamphetamine? No, that's unfair. I don't think anybody's in prison right now for simple possession of drugs. We don't do that, and nor do I necessarily think we need to. I think we need to deal with the most dangerous people. You know, I think there were have been laws that have been pretty harsh. I mean, I remember when I was a fairly new elected, being called over to the Governor Brown's office, and he called a bunch of DAs in and wanted to kind of bring this big stack of the penal code and had the Excel spreadsheets about how many people are in prison on indeterminate sentences. And he kind of was looking at us like, what do you got for me? Got any ideas? You know, and I'm kind of the new kid on the block, and I'm sure my colleagues were always worried about what's Anne Marie going to say today. But at the end of it, I said, you know, Governor, I do think we have an opportunity. I think there's an opportunity on what's called the felony murder rule, which is complex. And I think kind of people perked up because the felony murder rule, there's a movement across this country to reform it. Just leave it at that. But essentially, it's a rule that says if you engage in certain dangerous behavior and somebody dies, such as you break into somebody's home, you commit a robbery, but somebody accidentally gets shot or unintentionally, then the felony murder rule, which is a rule across this country, can allow you to prosecute under that theory. So I basically raised this idea, and I said, you know, I think there's an opportunity for us to work on this. And I'm not afraid to tell my colleagues, listen, people, let's have a conversation about this. And not long after that meeting, I got a few text messages from people saying, wow, that was an interesting idea. And not long after that, Senator Skinner introduced a bill on felony murder. And I ultimately thought it went too far because it gets in the weeds, but whatever. I mean, it is what it is. And so for me, it was just, you have to be willing to have those conversations.
So before we move on to the next section of questions, if I can just follow up on 47 and 57. So how would you fix them logistically? So is it a better financed, more thoughtful ballot measure, or is there other things that the Attorney General can do to fix the flaws?
I think that 47, well, both of them were ballot initiatives, so they're going to have to go back if you want, you know, ultimate overhaul of them. I think the Attorney General has an opportunity to step into that legislative battle. I'm not afraid to do that. I think it's about being holistic in the approach, because if the authentic intent behind Prop 47 was people that steal have drug problems, so let's get them treatment, well, then let's actually do that, because we're failing at that right now. We are. Look at walk down the street. We're failing. There's so much methamphetamine and fentanyl and everything else that's people's brains are just being perhaps permanently changed. And then we've got this theft that is grossly underreported. It just is. People want to say theft is down. The stats are showing it's down. Talk to the retailers or the people that are actually living it every day. So 47, maybe Prop 20 was maybe too much pie in the sky. But it does, if you think about 47, 57, that Prop 20 was trying to address some of those issues. So 57, there's lots of components to it. At the outset, one of the most significant components that we tried to deal with was this: how do you define violent crime? How do you define? That was one of the major things. That can be fixed in the legislature. And sadly, time and time again, even last week when the bill was introduced to make human trafficking of a child a violent crime, that was shot down. Whopping 3 people in the Senate Public Safety said, no, this is not going to make its way out. Those can be fixed by the legislature if they had the political will. The credits piece that is now the hottest topic probably under the corrections piece of 57 is very, very significant change. It's essentially giving corrections unfettered power to change sentencing schemes in California. And that's why 44 DAs are suing over this issue. It's really suing over the failure to hold public comment, but that is a very, very big issue. And for me, on the credits, listen, I think people should be incentivized in prison, but sitting in a chair not misbehaving is not the way to get people rehabbed. When somebody has got a long history of assaultive behavior, whoever it is, and they're told you should rehab by doing X, Y, and Z, and instead we just expedite credits, that's not rehab.
So, sorry, are you saying that the statistics that show that property crime continued to decline for 5 years or so, 6 years after voters passed Prop 47 is false?
I think it's grossly underreported. I think if you go ask somebody that's, there's a retailer that I know that says it's probably 20% of the actual theft is being reported. Go look at the photograph from the Union Pacific Railroad car. You think those were all reported as thefts? Do you think when you walk into a Marshall's or Kohl's or wherever, they're not reporting it? And it doesn't mean...
Wasn't the issue with the Union Pacific Railroad that they they laid off all their own security and then...
Well, who does that blame go to then? The blame doesn't go to the company. The blame goes to the thieves. I mean, I'm just talking about the statistics on theft. If you work in this business, you understand what's going on. It's underreported. We know that. We know the retailers. We know the grocers. We know it's not reported. We know that they have the hands-off policy, so people are emboldened. I mean, for every viral video, there's probably hundreds more that are happening every day.
So what other law enforcement statistics are not trustworthy?
What I said is it's underreported. I don't know. I mean, that's a bold, broad question. I think other crimes are underreported. Domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking. There's a lot of stuff that's underreported, but just because crime is not reported doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And it's just, the theft piece is, we have a serial theft problem.
So I guess if there's this strong desire to raise the alarm about it, why not report it and show that it's a problem? I mean, why just throw?
Because most people know nothing's happening. So all the folks in whatever, downtown Sacramento, San Francisco, that their car is getting broken into, do you think they're reporting it? No. Because most folks, I think, understand that there's really no consequences anymore, and the likelihood of catching somebody and the cost to their life, okay, should I report it or should I just go through my insurance company? So I think that there's, it's just a significant problem.
So a lot of people use the DOJ's data as the source of information. Right. Is there something you would do to improve reporting? Have you thought about that?
I thought about an app. I thought, well, maybe we can create an app where people can do a one-click thing to say, I got ripped off today or whatever.
So
I think people need to, there's certain people probably just never going to report it because it's, maybe it's too much in their lives. I don't know. But people also have to feel like something's going to happen. So yeah, we should always try to improve reporting. We should.
But you haven't thought of any, if you're elected DA, ways that you would necessarily change that?
My little app idea I thought was a pretty good idea. A one-click app. I just thought, well, how else can we make it simpler for people to report? We don't have enough law enforcement that you can even get someone to come out and take a police report. You can go to an online and spend an hour trying to figure out how to report everything. So we do maybe make it complicated. But it's two parts. It's the underreporting and it's the lack of consequences that people feel like they're getting.
We're going to move on here.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to pivot to the gang shootout in Sacramento that happened a couple of weekends ago.
Right.
I know you said you can't discuss ongoing cases, but I wanted to ask you about a specific involvement that your office had in the past in regard to Smiley Martin, who was one of the people arrested in the case. we reported that, he did only spend 4 years in prison despite a 10-year sentence. Part of that was due to these good conduct credits. It was also due to your office accepting a plea deal that involved dropping one of the charges against him that was for a violent felony, which was kidnapping. Looking back on this now, do you think it was the right choice to accept a plea deal, or, should it have instead gone to trial? How do you feel about that original prosecution?
I think my office responded and gave you a quote, which was, well, I will say this, I'm very comfortable with that plea. I mean, if you've read the transcript from the preliminary hearing, I think having lived in the system for a long time, understanding the complexities of domestic violence cases, a 10-year sentence is a very good plea. So I'm very comfortable with that. It's easy for people to look back and say, why didn't you prosecute him and convict him of every single crime that you had? But we look at every case individually. Obviously that had complexities to it. I don't really the transcript is the transcript from the preliminary hearing. But I believe very comfortably that that was a very good plea.
And you talked about the California's penal code and how you would like to see certain, offenses like human trafficking, domestic violence, which Smiley Martin was also pled no contest to, reclassified as, violent felonies. Right. Is this something that you would, as Attorney General, you would do another ballot measure for or push legislatively? How would you like to see those reforms happen?
Well, I have every intention of becoming a very loud voice in the legislature about why these types of crimes should be considered violent. I mean, I look at this as we are this incredibly progressive state, if you want to call it that, but we are not willing to call those crimes violent. And the reason why that's important is that you can have someone that's got a long history of violence, that has beaten women time and time again, or trafficked human beings with a long record of violence, but we're not willing to call those crimes violent. It belies logic to me, and it's just.
And why do you think that there's not that willingness to call those crimes violent? What are some of the political forces you would face?
The political forces?
Well, yeah, I mean, because obviously there have been, certain reforms, and Dave was talking about, over-incarceration, fear that this might impact, certain populations more than others. How would you kind of address those headwinds that you might face in the legislature?
Well, the political headwinds are that the folks in the legislature don't want to incarcerate people. And we have to have that balance. We have to have meaningful accountability. So when you beat a woman or you traffic a child and you have a long record of violence, is that somebody that we really believe should get out of prison if they've been handed a sentence for 12 years at potentially now at a third? Is that really? Because most folks think, what do you mean? That guy went to prison for robbery in the past and he's got a history of doing this and he hasn't rehabilitated in prison? Is that the person that we think we should let out without any rehab? So, it's two parts. It's accountability and it's rehab. And if we're going to hand out credits like Halloween candy without adequate rehab, we are not doing a service to that individual, to that crime victim, and to our community.
And so do you think the penal code or the credits is maybe what's the root of the issue here?
I think it's kind of both in a way. I mean, the long-term issue has been, for years, efforts have been made to change these laws. Human trafficking, domestic violence, rape of an unconscious. There's been years of legislative efforts to call those crimes what they are. The credits issue is recent. That is something that I think as people are starting to realize, what do you mean they got out? I think that is a tremendous power being given to an administrative branch of our government to decide. And even today, as many PRAs as you might file, you may not get an answer on what kinds of credits they earned or what did they actually do. Because when somebody's denied release, hypothetically, because you need to go do programming to deal with your anger management or domestic violence, what did they do? Or did we just hand out credits and let them out? That's the question that people we have to answer, because we're not doing a service to that person and to our community and to that crime victim that had the guts to finally come forward.
Great. Back to Ben.
Sure.
Can I just follow up real quickly?
Yes.
So you're talking about rehab not really being something California's following through on now. The state used to have a reputation in the 60s for being a pioneer on rehab. So people moved away from that. Do you think rehab can work?
Sure.
And what kind of investment would the state have to make? And what would you do to be sure the state made that investment to be sure that rehab really happened in California prisons?
Well, let me first start by kind of posing a question I posed to corrections in this public hearing last week, which we'll see if they answer. But how many convicted sex offenders are currently incarcerated in state prison? That's one question. I'm sure it's thousands, okay? Convicted, meaning that they are sentenced, they have to register under 290. Secondly, how many sex offender treatment programs that are designed to address that sexual issue? How many are there? How many treatment programs? Because from what I understand, it's one, maybe two at this point. But how many, what's the capacity of that treatment program? Because what I understand is maybe 100 people at a time. So the question then is like, what are we doing to deal with everybody talks about criminogenic needs and root causes. What are we doing to address those things? So yes, we should invest because the cost of failure to invest is further victimization, further endangering public safety, as I sit here and cough it up, but. So, you know, I think, I don't profess to be an expert on corrections, and because they do some really great work, don't get me wrong. I mean, I've been out to tour the prisons, and I was up at Pelican Bay earlier I guess the end of last year, but there are some really great things. But I think that the question is how good is it across all those 30 plus prisons? I mean, I actually one time said, why don't we publicize what they've done? You know, we publicize on the internet, like when somebody's coming up for parole. You know, one of the big divides with victims is that, you know, if somebody goes to prison, they don't know what the person's done. Has he or she done the work? Have they done the work? Maybe they won't be so angry that somebody might come up for parole then. So, but I don't think we're going to get that place. But I do think that, yeah, I think they do some great work. Don't get me wrong. I just think that we're at this point now with this credit calculation stuff that it's missing the point.
And would you push spending significantly more for rehab?
I think that's a very critical role. I mean, we're safer as a community if we prevent crime and we help people address their criminogenic needs. But just, again, handing out credits like for not doing something bad is not addressing their criminogenic needs.
Just to jump in super fast, I also wanted to talk about victims because we have talked a lot about criminals here today, and I'm sure you know Bonta, some of the other, I guess, more progressive DAs have come out recently, you know, kind of talking about legislation to help victims. Do you have any plans as Attorney General to kind of improve victim services or, you know, just enhance that part of the criminal justice response?
Well, I'd have to look and see what their proposals are because I don't know what I know they were supposed to have something yesterday and the trucker convoy got in the way or something. But, well, I'll tell you this, if I become the AG and George Gascon is still the DA of Los Angeles, I will make it a point to show up at parole hearings for those crime victims. I will oppose legislation that has been moving towards eliminating victims at those types of hearings, making them do Zooms or whatever it is, you know, giving them, I mean, I think that we have seen over time just the abandonment of their rights, you know, whether it's under Marcy's law, whatever it is. So, but in terms of whatever their proposals are, I'd want to look at them. That's about.
Would you be willing to take over cases in those?
Oh, sure. I'm not that I'm like a control freak. I just think that, yeah, because I'm not. But but don't ask my children. I have made it clear that if someone like Gascon, oh, thank you, stays in office and fails to do his job. I mean, let's be honest. Never in the history of this country that I'm aware of has a prosecutors union had to sue their boss to actually enforce the law. And so that's unheard of. But if Gascon, look what's going on there. There is almost a revolution within that county and in San Francisco about trying to recall these people because they're not doing their jobs. So if he is not going to do his job and enforce the law, then yeah, I'm going to step in and do it. I'm not, again, it's not something the AG's office has really ever had to do. Yeah, we step in when there's a conflict or, something like that, or now with officer-involved shootings, obviously the AG does that on some of these cases. But yeah, I do think that if you're not going to send someone to a parole hearing, no matter how dangerous that inmate is, then I'm going to do it for you. And I'm going to represent the crime victims so they don't have to be the ones reading the autopsy reports at a parole hearing.
So just a question about guns.
Yes.
A lower court,
I don't like them.
A lower court judge deemed the state's assault weapons ban unconstitutional. The federal judge. Ninth Circuit stayed that ruling, but obviously this is still a pending contest in courts. And I wonder, as AG, would you defend the state's assault weapon ban?
I defend whatever the law of California is, period.
Do you think the AG has any discretion to pick and choose which laws to defend?
Well, I suppose if you feel the law is unconstitutional, I guess you can. I haven't read that whole lawsuit in detail. But listen, as the AG, as the DA, I'm going to defend the law whether I agree with it or not. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with that issue. I think that, I don't agree with some of the 47, but I'm not going to change my opinion. I'm not going to change how I practice.
Do you agree or disagree with the assault weapon rule in California?
I don't know. I have to look at it again. I think we have major problems with illegal guns on our streets. That's how I would say it. I think I would do everything in my power to get those off the streets.
Do you think there's anything the state can do on the front end to prevent more guns from getting into the hands of people who shouldn't have them? I mean,
oh, sure. I think
are
there's
there gun control policies.
I think that, listen, we got the most everybody knows this, the most restrictive gun laws in this country. Somebody once said recently, it's not a gun control issue we have right now, we have a crime control issue. And for me, as whether it's the DA or as the AG, we have to fund law enforcement to take the guns out of people's hands that shouldn't have them. We can pass more and more gun control laws. That's what the legislature chooses to do. That's fine. But it's not going to stop people from getting illegal guns. It's like we can make murder illegal. It's not going to stop people from committing murders. So we have to be willing to go after the folks that have those weapons. Whether it's people subject to DVROs, whether it's people that are felons, we have a massive problem with felons in possession of firearms. They're everywhere. They are everywhere. They're all over Instagram. For whatever reason, people think they should post all this stuff. But, we have to be able to, those are the, felons in possession of firearms are the most dangerous people I'm worried about because no good deed comes from that combination.
Passing it back to Nigel.
So sometimes the relationship, depending on the issue between the AG and DAs and counties, can be kind of fractious. We certainly saw that earlier this year with the legal alert from Bonta to remind you that was related to Kings County. He issued this edict that said DAs don't prosecute women who miscarry and test positive for drugs, stillbirths or who miscarry. My question is, do you agree that that's within his purview to issue a legal alert, short of a legal opinion, that we said he might do that also? And on that specific issue, when it comes to the cases we saw in Kings County, where women tested positive for drugs, delivered stillbirths, and were prosecuted for murder, in both cases in prison, where do you stand on that?
I haven't read all of the Kings County stuff. I'm somewhat aware of it. I remember getting the legal opinion from Bonta. I don't have a problem with, as an AG, alerting people of what the law already is. So that's my opinion on that. I'm going to follow the law. I think my recollection of the Kings County thing, now, again, I don't want to, outstep my memory here, which might happen, but there's a body of case law that deals with this issue. And so that's where I think that was the fault in that case. So as elected as a DA, I'm going to follow the law. And the same thing as the AG. If I think a DA is stepping out of bounds, it could be the most hardcore Republican DA or conservative DA. It could be someone from this county, that county. If they're stepping out of bounds and I believe that that's what's necessary, then I'm going to do it. I will say this. I have built relationships with DAs across California of all different, kind of more liberal counties, more conservative counties. That's, I have spent years in this business, and that's why I suspect that many of them support me. Even if we disagree and I maybe yell at them one day or they yell at me or vice versa, we can still be professional and come together and try to figure out what the best solution is.
Okay, great. We're just going to kind of hit a few different issues here as we start to close up. Let's talk about housing.
Okay.
What specific actions?
What is what?
Sorry,
I didn't hear the first part.
I think he said what specific actions.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, sorry.
You're good.
Yeah. Question, pardon me. What specific actions would you support to enforce affordable housing laws and goals when it comes to RENA or what have you, especially the jurisdictions that refuse to sort of comply with what they're supposed to do when it comes to affordable housing? Is there anything that you can do as AG?
Sure. I mean, the housing laws, yeah, as the AG, I'm going to defend them. I mean, I think if a city or a municipality is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, we need more housing. Let's be honest. We shouldn't have to cost $800,000 for a unit to house somebody in this state. I don't think the housing crisis is so much related to the AG's office. I think the housing crisis is related to the astronomical number of regulations that and the costs. But as the AG, I'm going to defend the housing laws, and I'll step in if I need to. I may not answer it completely, but that's the best I can tell you.
Would that include sort of bringing enforcement if necessary?
If necessary, sure. If necessary. I do believe that that the position carries great opportunities at compliance. And if enforcement it's almost like progressive discipline. You got to kind of just go up the scale and get people to comply. And that's the goal. And if enforcement's necessary, then you enforce it.
Sure. This is one that folks have asked me about, online sports betting. Certainly the tribes here oppose it. Do you support it, or what is your position when it comes to these companies, FanDuel, DraftKings, and the rest of them?
I support the tribes in their sovereign authority to control the gaming. And their sovereignty. Pardon me?
Do you care to elaborate on that?
I mean, I think, California has a long history with tribes and granting them that sovereignty and that right to do tribal gaming. And I think that intercedes with their rights. And I think that out-of-state big old corporations coming on here to take away their business is something that I don't agree with. I don't profess to be an expert on tribal gaming. I do, or gaming in general. I mean, I do know that they're trying to collect signatures to do all this stuff, but I do think it impedes with what we had granted them in terms of authority over gambling.
Are you expecting to get campaign contributions from the tribes?
I got some early on, I think a couple tribes.
Are you expecting that to continue through the campaign?
I don't know. I mean, honestly, I haven't reached out to them lately. I don't know. I didn't say that just to get that funding.
And this is more of back to more of these global questions. We hit this a little bit with the question in Kings County, but regardless of the friction with the DAs, how much direction do you think the AG should give to district attorneys on which crimes to prosecute and which crimes to not prosecute? So whether it's the Stillbirth issue or more broadly, how strong of a hand are you going to take with the county?
I think I mean, let's be honest, DAs do have discretion. But when what happened on December 7th, 2020, when George Gascon dropped a bomb of directives, just wholesale refusal to do certain types of things. When we're talking about enhancements, special circumstances, all these other things that are addressing really violent crimes, treating people the same, even though this particular crime is very different than that crime. That's very different than saying I'm not going to prosecute, you know, a low-level driving on a suspended license type of case. Listen, some DAs don't choose to seek the death penalty, some do. So there is a level of discretion, obviously, that they're entitled to. But blanket policies, entire classes of crimes, I think are very different, particularly as you go up the scale of the level of criminal conduct. So I do think that the AG has the constitutional authority, and some people may say the duty to step in when a DA is not doing their job. And if that's necessary, that's necessary. It doesn't mean I would want to do that.
Since you brought up the death penalty, can I ask you about
Say that again?
Since you brought up the death
brought it
penalty,
up.
can I ask you about that? Because I know you've been quite at the forefront of pushing to try and bring that back in California. You obviously were very involved in 2016 in that initiative to try and speed up the process. Recognizing that the governor has instituted this execution moratorium at this point, is there anything that you can do or would do as AG to try and push that process along or bring it back in some capacity? I don't even know what's legally possible.
Well, I mean, the moratorium's a moratorium. I mean, I think I was pretty clear in my answers that I disagree with the moratorium, and mainly because Californians have voted time and time again to have this. As the AG, the job is to defend verdicts. And so I'm not going to be a political activist and hand those cases back to the counties where I think they might just ignore a jury verdict and dismantle that verdict. So for me, I think as the AG, you just do your job. The moratorium is the moratorium. It is what it is. My involvement on the death penalty issue was about reforms. People like to call it speeding it up, but the system's broken. That we can't ignore that. But I've also said, listen, I mean, I know the cases. I know these types of cases where juries make decisions. They are less than 2% of all murder cases. I have sat with those families, the moms of the little boys kidnapped, raped, and tortured to death. Okay, I know those cases. If the voters made a decision to say, we're done with it, then I'm going to respect that decision if that's what they choose. But it is the law. It is the law. And that's, in part why I disagree with the moratorium. Let's let the voters make a decision. They have time and time again. So. Right.
So I guess I'm asking, is there anything that you can or would do as AG to try and
to override the moratorium?
Bring it back?
Well, I think the governor has that authority. I think the job of the AG is to defend those, I shouldn't say defend it, to deal with the appeals. Maybe it's a legitimate appeal. So that would be my role. I think the governor has that authority on the moratorium. He's like chomping at the bit. He's got another one.
Okay, let me know if
we're ready. Go ahead.
So tell me what it would look like, right? If you were to take office and you had district attorneys who are doing things you don't agree with, whether SF or LA, day one, month one, year one, what are you actually doing to change that? I mean, are you prosecuting cases they're leaving, or what does that look like?
Well, that assumes they're still in office, okay? Because I don't mean it to be rude or flippant. I'm just saying I do think there's momentum in California, but in those particular jurisdictions. However, I'm not like a drop the bomb kind of gal. I do think that there's value in sitting down and having conversations with people, even if I don't think that there's going to be much that comes out of it. But I know Gascon. I've been with him. I went to a prison, I wasn't incarcerated, but I went to a prison with him to meet with inmates and talk with Scott Budnick and anti-recidivism. And so I know George, not personally, but I have sat with him before. Chessa's in my professional association. I can sit and have a conversation with the guy. So if those two prosecutors are still there when I get elected, then I'm going to sit down and have a conversation with them. Okay? It may not go the way maybe it doesn't go the way I think it should, but then it's the same thing. It's like, okay, what happens if they just say, boo-hoo, I'm not doing anything you suggest I do? Then I'm going to take a look at it. I'm not going to make all these decisions alone. I'm going to make sure that I surround myself with pretty darn smart people that I have tremendous respect for. Because at the end of the day, it's about it is about public safety. So I do, while I say I'm not afraid to step in, it's not necessarily what I would want to do, but crime victims do have a right and public safety do have a right. And so I would be willing, but I'm not going to go crazy the first day.
But wouldn't you, in a sense, be overruling the voters if they do survive the recall? That means the voters, right, supported what they're doing for the most
Well,
part.
obviously, I'm going to pay attention to what happens in the recall. So I think that's an interesting question, Poon. I think that, I mean, that's a valid question. I mean, I'd want to see what happens for sure. But, you know, when if you look at San Francisco, what's going on there, you know, only 30,000 Democrats in the city, but there's 80,000 people that signed this signature gathering, right? So it's not a Democrat. I think there's tremendous momentum in very Democratic cities. Because I think people are just realizing this is not public safety. This is not what I signed up for. I mean, it's just not.
I want to respect your time because we're at an hour, but if you've got a little bit more time, we just got a couple more, I think.
As long as they're not hard.
Nigel, I think you've got another one.
Nigel's asking all the hard questions.
Oh, we've got plenty of questions to worry about.
That's why he's in
Yeah.
The buffer zone.
Okay, well, let's talk about the internet a little bit. When it comes to, obviously, you regulating, you talking about companies in your own state, whether it's Meta, Facebook folks, or Twitter, or what have you. Should the Attorney General do more to protect privacy on the internet? And research is showing that kids are getting some deleterious effects, especially from Instagram. So what's your role when it comes to social media and the internet?
Well, I think the question was asked on the questionnaire. I think that there's two parts of whether I'm the DA of Sacramento, whether I'm the Attorney General. There's this significant prevention piece that needs to be a statewide effort, okay? It's almost like the fentanyl crisis. The fentanyl crisis is hitting everywhere of California and across this country. We need to deal with preventing the dangers of social media and what can happen to kids. I mean, if you heard the cases we get where people have met people online and they've solicited kids and they befriended them and all of a sudden it turns into a horrific child molest case, you'd be like, oh my God. So there's prevention. And like my office, years ago, we started doing all of this because we understood, we call it iSmart, Internet Social Media Awareness Resource Training. We train kids and parents. You know, they're selling fentanyl through Snapchat. Okay, that's what's happening. We partner now with some of these big groups to try to make sure that we get the message out there so we can educate kids through those apps. So there is a prevention component, which I think the AG can take a statewide role. Enforcement, yeah. I mean, I think I said in my questionnaire, I got to look at the data. I got kids. You know, do I think that there's great stuff coming out of all their hours that they're on the internet? Probably not. But I do think there's going to be there is probably increasing evidence of the depression and the mental health issues that we're seeing, the bullying that we're seeing. And what can we do? What can the AG do? I think they can do a lot to try to get in there and maybe call a meeting with those folks and say, what can we do with your algorithms or whatever you're doing? But I'm not going to sit there and, you know, give you this blanket policy without understanding all the data and the information before I give you that opinion. But listen, I'm a parent. You know, I get it. But I think that it's especially with COVID, we're going to see even more long-term mental health impact of what we're seeing.
Sure. And you talked about sitting down and talking with them. When you consider this step of filing suit, I mean, especially when it comes to some of these privacy violations, or at least at this point, alleged privacy violations?
Well, alleged is a good word. I don't know. I mean, I guess I can say as a lawyer, I'm always considering a suit. But I think you got to have the information first, Nigel. I'm not trying to avoid the question. I'm just saying I'd want to have the information presented to me from whoever's doing the investigation and then consider it.
That's it for me as far as our list. I don't know if anyone has follow-ups. I have maybe one or two.
Yeah, could I ask one question? Yeah, just a political question. So, just curious, when voters get their ballot, they're going to see Rob Bonta, Democrat. They know what that means.
This is a viability question. I know it.
It is a viability question. Yeah, and they're going to see Hockman and Eric Early and Republican. They kind of understand what that means. They're going to see NPP,
sure.
No party preference. They maybe don't know what that means, and if they do, don't necessarily know where you stand. So do you think that is a liability for your campaign?
I think I'm very comfortable running as an NPP. I think if people educate themselves, listen, we are in a time in California that there is tremendous momentum where people are realizing that this issue, crime and perhaps homelessness and drug addiction, mental health, are the top issues. And, you know, hopefully people read my ballot statement. I'm a prosecutor. Okay, it's all I've ever done. I love what I do. I'm not in this for politics. I love public safety. I believe in it. And we are at a moment in time in this state where people, no matter their party affiliation, are like, this is not working. And I'd like someone there that knows what they're doing. And I'd like to believe that when people see who I am as a person and what I've done as a professional, they're going to go, that woman is the real deal. And so, you know, I'm proud to be supported by law enforcement. It is not a coincidence. It's because I've been in the business a long time. They know, I mean, if I was a really crappy DA and didn't really know what I was doing and I was messing up all the time, that might be different. But I believe very strongly that I have led this office and I've led this county. By the way, I've been reelected twice in a highly Democratic county because I am good at what I do. And I believe in public safety, irrespective of politics. And I think we're at a point, and the momentum is there, particularly when you're seeing what's going on in LA and San Francisco, that public safety will transcend politics. And this is the moment for that to happen.
So I have a question about that. You mentioned law enforcement. You do have the support of, and have had the support of a fair amount of law enforcement agencies. And yet, in 2019, California passed the use of force law. Part of the consequence of those efforts was to get the Attorney General's office involved in investigating officer shootings at the local level.
Right.
Did that go too far, or was that necessary? And how aggressive do you think you would be in investigating officer shootings at the local level and overseeing those investigations?
Well, I wrote a letter of support for that bill, so I was content with that. I don't honestly, I don't care if it's the DA or the AG. Just make it full, fair, and independent. And you know, there was momentum for that to be taken out of the DA's hands. I think it's perfectly fine going to the Attorney General as long as you're getting a full, fair, and independent investigation and things are not politicized. So that's what I don't have any problem with it going to the AG's office.
So are there certain things that you learned from the Stephon Clark case that you would bring to that role if you're elected, looking back?
I mean, not that I didn't know the challenges of this job, but, you know, I think there's a human toll to all of it. There's just, you know, look what happened downtown, right? And in about a 2-week period of time, we had hundreds of people. We had to put up a fence around our building. You know, I'd never had a piñata made in my head, and all of a sudden somebody made a piñata. And so for me, you have to be willing to recognize that these are difficult conversations and there's community anger that we have to be willing. But I also know that what my job is, and that is to follow those facts and that law. And even though they're hard decisions, you still have to do that. So I don't know if that means what I learned out of it is that I guess it just more exemplifies that we have to make hard decisions sometimes.
I also wanted to ask a personal question.
Personal?
Sort of personal. Sorry, that sounds weird. It's related to your job.
Okay.
So obviously, like as a prosecutor working in the system, you do come across a lot of these very difficult, very traumatic cases. And I'm wondering how you yourself handle that. I mean, obviously it's kind of oftentimes very ugly side of human nature that you're dealing with, just in terms of the toll and the death and just everything. So how do you handle that, process that, continue on kind of a thing?
I think it's, you know, I don't really have a lot of balance right now, but I do think that balance is a really important part of my life. I'm an outdoorsy person. I love to kayak, I love to hike, I like to travel with, you know, whatever. Go to Yellowstone is my favorite place. I've been there like 5 times in the last couple of years. But I think it's important because to get outside this job, because there is beauty in this world, even though there's a lot of sadness and ugliness in the profession. So, you know, surround yourself with people, friends, and it's the same thing most people do, but you have to also recognize that this criminal justice system, it's not all of life. It is a huge part of, it's all my profession, but there's also there's goodness to humanity, and so that's kind of what I'd say.
I have a question. In the DOJ's office, there are all these boards, RIPA, Reparations Committee, all these different offshoots that have been stationed within the DOJ. How would you add your imprint to those committees? Would they continue like they're going? Would you change anything? Have you thought much about that?
Not much. I mean, I recognize that there's a lot of pieces to the AG's office, but I'd have to look at each one of them. I mean, they're established for a reason. So I look at them, you know, what's their purpose? What's their mission? Are they actually accomplishing things? So I think it's premature for me to say on each one. That's what I'd probably say, which is kind of not an answer, but
like with reparations, would you change? Have you been paying attention to the news on any?
Only a little bit.
Okay.
I mean, I know there's been some recommendations that were recent hearings that were done, but I promise you I'll get in and study it. That's what I do know.
Good. Anything else, anybody? Well, thank you.
Thank you for your time, you guys. Very much.
Thank you.